3, 2, 1. Welcome to this video where we try to learn some lessons from John and Martha King's forced landing that occurred to them in 1975 just north of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. This is part of an ongoing conversation I want to start with other air traffic controllers about lessons that controllers can learn about how we can best respond to a wide variety of in-flight emergency situations. Buckle your seatbelt, and I mean that literally, for this video. Let's get started. First of all, if you don't know who John and Martha King is, I deduce from that you're not a GA pilot in the United States. Practically every GA pilot in the U.S. knows who John and Martha King are. Many of them have done like I've done and have learned and used stuff from the many courses that they teach. They've been in business for about 50 years, and as you can see from the top of their homepage, King Schools has helped more than 500,000 pilots reach their aviation goals. I think I've been a customer since about 1985. I'm not here to promote them. There are other places that do good ground school materials and so on, but I do want to note that John and Martha are absolutely legends in the GA community. They do a tremendous amount with regard to safety and so on. They are very influential within the FAA in a variety of capacities, and frankly, John and Martha have been one of the driving forces between the new airman certification standards that the FAA uses for teaching and evaluating pilots. With that in mind, one of the things that John and Martha do really well is go through this topic of risk management. I'm going to click on risk management here. Risk management is more than just about teaching the basic skills and understanding systems and so on. It's about teaching kind of the mindset, kind of that aeronautical decision making about a variety of things. So among other things, if you're interested, I'm not trying to sell anything here, you can go to their website and you can view some stuff about practical risk management for pilots, how to approach takeoffs and landings, single pilot IFR, stall spins, different kinds of emergencies. As you can imagine, I bought that one some years ago. But also there's one here that's free called How to Avoid Unwanted Adventure. If you click on this one, you're welcome to do so, but you'll find that they have a 56-minute video where they talk about some things, including this crash that happened in 1975. So if you'd like to view the story about the accident from their own mouths, you're welcome to go and do that. Another way you can do it, if I just close this window and go to YouTube, you can search for the Kings on Risk Management, and we're not stealing any business from them. You saw that particular course was free, but this is a kind of talk that they've done repeatedly. On YouTube, it comes up with some videos that they filmed at the FAA Safety Center at the Sun and Fun Air Show in 2009, 2008, 2007, and to this day they continue to tell this story routinely at Oshkosh and Sun and Fun to pilots who were there. So you're welcome to go to one of these places if you want to hear the story straight from the horse's mouth. I'm going to tell the story myself rather than direct you there, in part because I want to simplify a little bit, in part because the way they tell the story, the emphasis is on risk management for pilots, and a lot of what they talk about is some of the risk management things to think about sort of before you take off and as things begin to unfold. I want to adapt what they're teaching the pilots and teach some principles to controllers as part of this ongoing conversation. So let's get started on that. I want to start by going to skyvector.com, and I've built a simple little direct flight plan here from La Junta, Colorado up to Sioux Falls. Let me tell you a little bit of the backstory. John and Martha King, at this point in their early business career, were going around the country teaching weekend ground schools. So they would put out ads and sign you up for Saturday and Sunday, 2-day intensive ground school. You take your written exam on a Monday. And so John and Martha, who were based out of San Diego, were very often leaving San Diego on something like a Friday morning, traveling on Friday to wherever it was they were going for the weekend. They'd get to the hotel, they'd set up all their teaching aids and gear. That night, Saturday, all these people from the local area would come in. They teach ground school Saturday and Sunday, and then John and Martha would fly back on Monday and do business things during the week. So they were flying a turbocharged Cessna 210. They were both instrument rated qualified. They were both instructors. They were flying routinely. By the way, John and Martha alternate who gets to fly each leg. So this particular leg was John's leg. Martha had taken off that morning from San Diego area, had flown them out to La Junta, where they stopped for lunch, pit stop, top off the airplane, get an updated weather briefing, and so on. And then they had about a 3-hour flight in the Turbo 210 up to Sioux Falls. For our purposes, I'm going to describe the flight this way. At the moment, I've got this plotted as just a direct course, in reality, and it doesn't really affect things, but they were probably hopping from VOR to VOR. So I'm going to drag this over the Goodland VOR, just kind of assume for our purposes that they were going direct Goodland and then up to Sioux Falls, and you'll see why I'm doing that in a minute. The weather for this flight was basically going to be something like 800 to 1,000 overcast as far as the forecast was concerned, with the clouds a few thousand feet thick, and that put the tops at ballpark 10,000 feet for most of the flight. The forecast was for Sioux Falls to be improving, and it might be VMC by the time they got up there. And so what they did was they took off. They obviously had an IFR clearance. They climbed up through the clouds, and somewhere around 10,000 feet, they got on top. They broke out. It was beautiful up on top, completely VMC up above the clouds. Beautiful Friday afternoon. Sun was still up. Beautiful day, and so they canceled IFR and declined VFR flight following. By the way, it's perfectly legal. They're VMC, even though all of the region is IFR down low. Okay, they're up above. And it's, as far as I'm concerned, that's a safe way to fly. But what happens is, not long after they canceled IFR and also declined the VFR flight following, somewhere approximately near Goodland, suddenly they had a low voltage light. The alternator, it turns out, had failed. Now, let's think about this for a second. What if they were still on their IFR flight plan? Well, what they would have done, and what any prudent pilot should have done, assuming they were somewhere around the Goodland VOR area, is declared a mayday with the appropriate ATC facility, explain that they were having an alternator failure, and what that means is the engine's going to run just fine on the magnetos, but now the battery's going to have to power all the avionics, and so for planning purposes, they've got something like 20 to 30 minutes before they really should be on the ground. Also, if you're trying to conserve battery power in a situation like that, a prudent pilot will recognize that any device that transmits actually uses much more wattage, drain off the battery, than anything that receives. Therefore, they can receive and they can listen to ATC kind of all day long. They can receive VOR signals and ILS localizer signals and so on, more or less all day long, so to speak. But what they can't do is transmit a lot, so they can't do a lot of talking on the comm radio. It also means that prudent pilots will often consider turning off their transponder, because the transponder is frankly a broadcast device. It continuously is broadcasting the 4-digit squawk code and the mode C altitude. So in that kind of situation, they might have done that, and ATC would have had to just set them up for an instrument clearance, let's say, into Goodland, and once they do that, John and Martha would have had no problem getting into Goodland. As it turns out, because they'd already canceled their IFR clearance, one option that John and Martha had was to do essentially the same thing, only just popping back up on frequency and kind of saying, hey ATC, this is so-and-so. I know you don't know who we are, but we're declaring an emergency. We've had an alternator failure. We are instrument equipped and qualified, and we just need to pick up a quick approach into Goodland before our battery dies. Okay, so that's one thing that they could have done, and that's one takeaway from this lesson, although frankly that's not what the focus is in this video. What John and Martha decided to do, and this is one of the things they talk about in the video, and so I won't dwell on it anywhere near as long as they did, they realized that, if we land somewhere around Goodland and try to get the airplane fixed, who knows what the exact problem is, if we're going to need a new alternator, how long it'll take. In the meantime, we're stuck down here in Kansas. We're supposed to be up there tomorrow morning teaching a ground school up in Sioux Falls. So what they elected to do was just turn the battery off, and that way save it for later. Calculate what kind of compass heading they would need. For our purposes, we'll assume it's something like a 028, corrected for whatever winds aloft they were expecting and so on. But just deadhead or dead reckon for about 2 hours, 2.25 hours or so, and that should get them up to the Sioux Falls area. But who knows exactly how good their calculations would be on the compass heading would be, how accurate the winds aloft forecast would be, and so on. So they figured that'll get us up to kind of the Sioux Falls area, and once we get up to the Sioux Falls area, then we'll just turn the battery back on that we turned off 2.5 hours earlier. And if it's VMC, we can just dodge the clouds on the way down and land, and we'll go from there and get the airplane repaired while we're teaching the ground school over the weekend. If it's IFR when they get up there, if it's solid overcast, okay, then they'll just call out of the clear blue and say, hey, ATC, you don't know who we are, but we're declaring an emergency. We've had an alternator failure. We just need to get cleared for an approach, and we can shoot the approach early, no problem. Okay, so that was their plan, but if that's what had happened, there wouldn't be a story to tell. Here's what happened. So they get up to somewhere around the Sioux Falls area. They turn the battery back on, and you know what? There's nothing. The battery had drained for whatever reason, and there's nothing. And just so you know, the weather hadn't lifted. It was still IMC throughout the region. All right, so now what do they do? And just for the record, at this point you might be wondering why we're talking about this, because we're a bunch of controllers, and these guys are never going to talk to controllers for the remainder of the flight. So there's really nothing that ATC is going to do. They've had the battery turned off, so there's no transponder that's on, and so on. But what I want to do is take a couple of things from what happened later in the flight, because the principles involved show some good and some bad ways to handle a situation like this that can be adapted for other situations. So first of all, usually when we think of like VFR in IMC situations, think about the situation where we have a VFR pilot who's stuck on top of an overcast layer. So maybe somebody had taken off, was heading down to Sioux Falls, and it was supposed to be, the weather improving to VMC, and they get up there and the weather, forecast was just totally wrong, and it's all IMC, and now the person circles trying to find a gap. They can't find it. They're getting low on fuel, and they call us up out of the clear blue and say, hey, I'm with you. Here's who I am. I'm declaring an emergency. I'm on top of this overcast layer, and I'm about out of fuel, by the way. Yikes. We have just a few minutes to figure out how to do that. One of the options that I advocate controllers should have in a situation like that one is, and let's assume that the cloud bases are at least 1,500 feet AGL. I'll talk separately in a different set of videos about what to do if the clouds are lower than that. But if the cloud bases are something like 1,500 feet AGL or better, one of the options we have is just let them down through the clouds, just get a descent going, keep the wings level, keep the speed under control. The airplane will descend through the clouds. Once you get down to 1,500 feet or so, now you're VMC underneath, and then you just kind of figure it out from there, but at least then you're VMC. In principle, that's what John and Martha did. Now, obviously, they're instrument qualified. The airplane, in effect, was not IFR equipped any longer because they didn't have any nav radios and so on. They also didn't have an electric turn coordinator. I'm sorry, the electric turn coordinator would have been depowered because of the battery failure, but with the attitude indicator working, you can work around that, no big deal. Now, John and Martha did know exactly where they were, and obviously this is a modern sectional, not a sectional from 1975. But in 1975, there was then, as there is now, some tall antennas kind of southeast of town. This one here is almost 2,000 feet AGL to the top of the light bulb there and so on. So they knew they wanted to avoid that. But basically what they did was they went north for about 10 or 15 minutes, kind of put themselves somewhere up in here. Again, they didn't know exactly where they were. And they did just kind of this let down through the clouds. The forecast was for something like 1,000 overcast. They figured they would just get underneath, be VMC, and then they would orient themselves based on the road pattern and so on and go from there and divert to one or another of these airports. That's actually reasonable under the circumstances. So they did that. As they entered the clouds, they picked up their first load of ice, and one of the things you don't have in most GA airplanes, if you don't have any electrical power, is you don't have pitot heat. And so in addition to the ice on the airplane, the pitot tube also froze, which means no airspeed indication. Apparently, the airspeed indicator, for whatever reason, in this particular case, actually showed something less than 0, and John was perhaps a little worried that the airplane was flying backwards, but I beg to differ in my professional opinion. I think they were flying forward at all times. Having said that, they had a pitot tube failure, as it were. Once you do that, pitch plus power provides predictable performance. That is, if you have a known pitch attitude for the aircraft and a known power setting, you should be able to approximate your airspeed. Those expectations might have been slightly off in this case because the airplane itself had a load of ice. Having said that, at first glance, what they did was quite reasonable. They descended down through the clouds. Now, keep in mind, they hadn't talked to anybody for about 3 hours, and so they didn't have an altimeter setting, so they were having to kind of take an educated guess as to what the altimeter setting was. So they couldn't know exactly what their MSL altitude was because they didn't know exactly where they were. They didn't know exactly what the terrain height would be and what they had for, power lines and other towers. Some of these are probably cell phone towers that are more modern, of course. But what they did was they descended through the clouds, and when they got to what they guessed was 1,000 AGL, they were still in the clouds. So they went down a little more, They were still in the clouds, and they figured that wasn't real good. So they climbed back up, and near the top of the clouds, they picked up their second load of ice. They got back VMC up on top of the clouds. Again, they were somewhere up in here and tried to figure out what to do. Apparently, John thought that maybe they could just fly around for a little while, find another airplane, and then follow it down through the clouds, and Martha talked him out of that one. Obviously, what they were going to have to do was just do that let-down procedure again and just take the risk and descend down more and more until they eventually broke out lower than what they really wanted to do. That was clearly the least bad option that they had, and in an emergency, what we're typically seeking is the least bad option. I understand that John really didn't want to do this, but then Martha was kind enough to point out to him that if he looked to the west, he would see that the sun was setting, and she asked him if he would rather do this in the daytime or in the nighttime, at which time John said something like, "Martha, you're really getting on my nerves." Anyway, Martha was right, though. It was time to head down, so they descended once more, and they got down to within about 100 feet or so of the ground as far as they were guessing when they broke out. And yeah, they were that low. At that point, they were between the proverbial rock and a hard place. It was just a matter of time before they ran into a line of trees or hit, some power lines or a silo or a farmhouse or something. It was incredibly risky, and as they flew along within just a couple of minutes, as they were coming up on a snow-covered cornfield, they realized that they had to make a landing in that snow-covered cornfield, and so they pulled the power back to idle, and they were touched down on the cornfield. Now let's talk about this for a second. Usually when we think about forced landings, we're talking about engine failures, and the engine failure is what forces you to land off airport. You can't have a forced landing to an airport. Usually we're talking off airport if we talk forced landing. This was a different kind of a forced landing. They were not really wanting to land in some cornfield somewhere, but they were sort of forced to do so by the unique circumstances they had gotten into. And so for our purposes, what I want to concentrate is the forced landing. Remember, up until this point, even for all the drama that's going on, they're actually physically perfectly fine. There's no injuries. Certainly neither one of them's died or anything like that. Typically in emergencies, you're fine during the flight itself, and everything is going to come down to those critical few seconds as you actually make the touchdown and get the airplane to a stop and then get out of the airplane. So what happened with John and Martha? And here's something that was, in my mind, something of a big mistake that they didn't make. In effect, it had never dawned on them that they might have to make an off-airport forced landing, and so they weren't prepared for it. They hadn't done anything that would improve their survivability odds. Now, clearly they survived because they're still with us 45 years later, okay? But what happened was this. When they touched down in that snow-covered field, first of all, the flaps were up. With the electrically powered flaps, there was no way to put the flaps down because the airplane had picked up basically 3 loads of ice, once on the way down, once on the way up, once on the way down again. You really probably don't want to put flaps down with an iced-up airplane anyway, so they were definitely touching down fast. They did have the gear down because they'd put the gear down, which you can do even if the electrical system is shut off. So they touched down actually fairly fast on that snow-covered field. There was a little thin coating of ice up on top of the snow, and so when they touched down, the airplane rolled just for a few feet basically, but then the wheels broke through the ice, dug into the snow, and the nose came to a very sudden stop, and they stopped really quick. The airplane did not quite flip over. It ended up basically vertical on its propeller spinner, but then kind of came back down and oriented itself fairly normally. Now, normal people get out of the airplane at that point if they can. John and Martha sat there for about 15 minutes listening to the sounds of fuel dripping in and around the hot engine before they bothered to get out, even though John was uninjured, and we'll talk about Martha's injuries in a minute. Why did John wait so long? Was he trying to come up with some good joke with John's sense of humor and maybe it just takes a while? No. It's because they hadn't prepared and they had all the luggage and teaching aids in the back of the airplane, and when they came to the sudden stop, that stuff came forward and pushed their seats forward and basically pushed John and Martha up against the instrument panel. But they were still able to maneuver a little bit. The problem was, once they were kind of pushed forward, they could not reach back to where the door handles were, and because they hadn't prepped for the forced landing, they hadn't unlatched the doors before touchdown, and they could not get out of the airplane because they couldn't reach the door handles at that point. It took about 15 minutes before John was able to maneuver the luggage enough to push his seat back to get out of the airplane. As he walked around the front of the airplane to go assist Martha and let her out the right side, he noticed that there were a whole bunch of tools scattered across the snow out in front of the aircraft, hammers and screwdrivers and wrenches and things like that, whereupon John had a epiphany. Epiphany's even a town over here. He had an epiphany, and he suddenly realized he was not the first airplane to crash in that snow-covered field. I'm not sure what Martha said to him about that. But anyway, he walked around, and when he opened the door and was helping Martha out of the airplane, he realized why it was the back of her head had been bleeding so profusely. Those tools out in front of the airplane had hit Martha in the back of the head on the way out. In other words, because they hadn't prepped for the forced landing, they hadn't even thought to try to stow or secure any heavy, loose objects. That's another takeaway from this particular landing that I want to kind of apply in other kinds of situations. So controllers, if we ever have a pilot who's getting ready to make a forced landing, I'm actually very concerned with the answer to the question about the number of people on board, about whether it's one person or more than one. If it's one person, it's the pilot and they're pretty busy, right? If it's more than one, though, so it could be 2, could be 5, whatever the number is. If we have a few minutes, it might be possible in some cases to get the passengers to secure any heavy, loose items, if possible, before touchdown. And that way, if they are making a forced landing into a cornfield, whether it's snow-covered or not, and the airplane comes to a complete stop, or a sudden stop, or flips over or something like that, perhaps that keeps something like a toolbox from hitting somebody in the back of the head and killing them or potentially seriously injuring them. So controllers, please, if somebody's going to make a forced landing, try to spend some time prepping them for the survivability of the landing with some things like that. Seat belts tight as you can. Doors unlatched if applicable for that airplane. It's not applicable for all airplanes. If there's passengers on board, get them to protect their heads if they can, and if time permits and if they can, secure any heavy and loose objects. And that, controllers, might make a huge difference in the survivability. Okay, we'll talk about something else that can make a huge difference in some other cases as well. But with that, we're going to kind of leave the lessons from John and Martha, and we're going to take these principles and kind of take them for a spin by looking at 3 other incidents that have made the NTSB's records and so on. So let's switch gears, and let's go to the first of these. Now, by sheer coincidence, this one happened in Salem, South Dakota, and if I go back to the sectional chart for a second, I don't even have to move the chart. Salem is right here, so by sheer coincidence, the accident which we're about to look at, which unfortunately was fatal, probably happens only about 20 miles or so from where John and Martha went down about 40 years earlier. The pilot was the only person on board. He was killed, and this one happened such that about 15 minutes after departing on a cross-country flight in Day VMC, the pilot contacted Sioux Falls Approach to report that he was having chest pain and was intermittently blacking out, was having difficulty controlling the airplane. The controller continued to communicate with the pilot for about 20 minutes before radio contact was lost. The wreckage was subsequently located in a farm field, and the pilot, turns out, had a heart attack. We're going to come back to this report in a minute, but before we do, I want to first go to the ATC transcript that's available in the public docket materials on the NTSB's website for this particular crash. We're not going to go through the whole thing in detail. Of course, you're welcome to on your own. But what I want to point out is this pilot kind of shows up out of the clear blue, says, I've been hit by this ungodly chest pain, okay? I'm having this squeezing sensation in my chest. It feels like a semi is sitting on me and so on. I think I'm blacking out. I'm worried about maintaining control of the airplane. Now, obviously, it's going to take a minute or two for any controller to kind of get their mind around this and so on. Keep in mind, he didn't have the airplane on radar yet. As the pilot describes a little bit more about what's going on, okay, he's trying to find where the airplane is. He does give him the altimeter setting and so on. I'm having this tremendous chest pain. My left arm, I can hardly move it. I've got stabbing pains around my heart. My vision's going in and out. I'm trying to hold the plane here. So obviously this is a desperate situation. The controller is going to ask in a minute, are you alone or do you have a passenger? Absolutely fantastic question, because that makes a huge difference in the handling. again, I feel bad because I'm going to argue in a minute. This controller and the supervisor both did a wonderful job. You always understand with hindsight, you can find something to do better. And so in the spirit of that, where I absolutely support essentially what they were doing, I would like to say that trying to find if they're the only person on board the plane maybe gets moved up a little bit sooner. Having said that, the controller does try to provide what limited medical help is possible. So I have someone with some medical training here. They're saying possibly try to cough as hard as you can. I can't speak to whether ATC called 911 to try to get some medical advice and so on. But having said that, the pilot realizes I may be having a heart attack and so on. As part of that, he says, I'm going to try and stay over a farm field here to make sure I don't get anywhere near houses or a neighborhood. I do not want to go near Sioux Falls or Mitchell or whatever and, threaten people on the ground. So that gives you some idea how serious this is. Now, with that in mind, one of the things that the controller says is, okay, we believe you're about 27 miles west of Sioux Falls. We do have lat long from that, assuming that's you, so we think we've got you on radar. If you are able to land on a road or something like that, we'll get services out to your position as soon as possible. Now, I want to pause on that for a second. I don't know what you think about that idea of the controller suggesting, hey, just put it down on a road or something like that. In principle, I am 110% behind the controller. I think that's a fantastic suggestion. This is an extreme situation where the pilot is the only person on board the airplane. Granted, the controller doesn't know it quite yet for about 20 seconds. But he's the only person on board the airplane. He's intermittently blacking out. You can't send him 15 minutes over towards Sioux Falls Airport and near where the city of Sioux Falls is and so on. The best option in this extreme situation is a forced landing in something like a farm field or a road. For what it's worth, and I don't want to go into too much detail here, the supervisor gets on the frequency at some point and says, I need you to find a road. And a little bit later, he's going to say there are several large county roads that we would highly recommend. So maybe go to the road. A little bit later, he's going to say a road or a field. I do want to opine on this a little bit. I'm going to go back to the sectional first. So it turns out that the airplane is approximately in the Salem area. Where the airplane goes down is actually down around here, just south of where this very tall tower is and so on. But having said that, for discussion purposes, let's say we know that the airplane is approximately over in this area. As far as roads go, for a normal forced landing, something like an engine failure when it's VMC, I am, in short, and there's more to discuss at a different point in this conversation, I'm a big fan of rural divided highways. If you work through all the factors that are involved in those are fantastic off-airport landing sites, assuming that it's an engine failure and you can still maneuver the airplane and so on. And when you come in, if there's a construction zone or traffic is just really clogged up, you can sidestep to the field and have people in cars watching you as you make your touchdown and so on, so they can rescue you right away. That's fine. But this is an unusual situation, and even if it's an engine failure, forced landing in VMC, generally speaking, other roads other than what I call rural divided highways, these things are nasty. There's a very high statistical likelihood that there are power lines running along one side or the other that crisscross to go from the lines maybe on the west side of the road to the houses on the east side. You can have opposite direction traffic on these two-lane roads. You could have, trees that, people, their houses up there and they got a tree right next to the road. Statistically, that's bad. The farm fields statistically are going to be better. Obviously, it can vary depending where you are in the country. I've got Google Maps kind of zoomed in on the area, but generally speaking, if you were just kind of throwing a dart at a dartboard that looked like this, roads are generally going to be bad. Farm fields, obviously you can have trees, you can have drainage ditches, you can have obviously farmhouses, occasionally, but generally speaking, you aim for farm fields, your odds go up. And in an emergency, sometimes what you're trying to do is what's least bad, and you just have no choice but to play the statistics a little bit. Back to the NTSB final report. For what it's worth, let's go to the medical and pathological information very briefly. The autopsy indicated that the pilot's cause of death was multiple blunt force injuries, of course due to an airplane crash, in turn due to what was a heart attack and so on. But the actual cause of death was multiple blunt force injuries. It was the impact itself. And the pilot, it seems, blacked out when he, before he landed and so on. But here's the thing. I want you to notice, if you've watched me fly the flight sim, how little I often touch the controls, and if I let go of the controls, the airplane doesn't just nosedive in somewhere. So let's try to see if we can understand how the airplane actually impacted. Now there's going to be some luck involved here, assuming that the pilot blacked out before landing, which we can't be positive about. But in the wreckage and impact information, I want to point out a couple things. First of all, it does give the latitude, longitude. If I just cut and paste that, so I'm going to cut it here, go back to Google Maps, come up here, paste it, hit enter. I'll just collapse that side panel. This actually shows where the airplane came to rest, okay, a couple miles south of Interstate 90, a couple miles further south from the town of Salem itself, and it was in a farm field. But again, it says a debris field, wheel tracks and ground scars in the field indicated that the airplane contacted the ground about 700-ish feet north of where it came to rest. So the initial touchdown was 700 feet north of where it came to stop. In other words, it wasn't a crater. It actually landed probably fairly decently, and in fact, a lot of GA airplanes, you touch down on a normal runway and a normal landing, your ground roll is something on the order of 700 feet. So I expect that overall, the deceleration from touchdown until it came to a stop should have been fairly normal. Now that's going to kind of average the deceleration. Who knows if there was a spike and so on. One other thing I'll point out before we go away from this NTSB final report, the wind was 200 at 13. That's enough wind that if we ever have something like this, and again, I want to be very careful here. I think the controller and the supervisor were absolutely correct to say you need to land this thing down now. That is the least bad thing. I'm advocating for fields rather than road. But if we're ever going to do that, I'll talk in a few minutes about the specific airplane configuration. But if we find that the winds are something like 200 at 13 knots, if it's 3-knot winds, it might not matter. But once you get above 5, certainly above 10 for GA airplanes, if you can, try to have them land into the wind. Having said that, because the initial touchdown point was north of where it came to rest, the airplane, it turns out, was heading generally southbound into a 13-knot headwind, and so I'm actually kind of thinking that these deceleration forces should have been fairly decent. Unfortunately, this guy had some bad luck. We don't know if he would have died from the heart attack anyway, but if you go back to where the airplane came to rest and measure roughly 700 feet north, okay, what you'll find is the airplane, I'm guessing, probably actually made a very survivable landing somewhere down around here. Might have bounced once or twice, and unfortunately, just this was kind of bad luck. This is clearly, to my eye, a drainage ditch, and I suspect that he was probably still moving at a good clip when he hit the drainage ditch, and the airplane came to a stop there, and that is what actually killed him. So sometimes it's just, you can have good luck, bad luck, providence, whatever. Sometimes you can have a line of trees or the, farmhouse or something like that, or a drainage ditch. But to a first approximation, in some extreme emergency situations, if somebody's putting it down in a field, yeah, you can have things like that. But if you land them into the wind and get the airplane configured the way I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, we improve the odds as much as possible, even though we can't eliminate all of the risk. Let's look at a different one. This one's about 4 years ago. I'm filming this here in November of 2020, so it's not quite 4 years ago. This one took place in Minnesota. This was a Mooney, and the pilot was seriously injured. The accident occurred during the commercial pilot's third flight of the day in the accident airplane. Turns out he had carbon monoxide poisoning. Without going through the specifics of how it works, the short version is that if you get a crack in your exhaust pipe and or muffler system, the way the airplane cabin heat works for many GA airplanes, then you can get carbon monoxide leaking from the exhaust pipes into the cabin, and that seems to be what happened to this pilot. For what it's worth, and again, you can read through this in detail if you want, he was on autopilot when he basically blacked out. So he went Nordo for about an hour. Minneapolis Center and other facilities really did everything they could to attempt to contact the pilot without success. I've read the transcript, I won't share it here, but they really did try pretty hard. Of course, the pilot had blacked out. There was nothing they could do. The airplane continued to fly on autopilot in heading hold mode until it ran out of fuel, and then it crashed in an open field. Now, again, the pilot was still blacked out, so crashing in an open field is obviously a matter of luck or whatever you want to call it. And the pilot was not conscious until after the airplane landed in the field. He then wakes up. He's very confused, which makes sense to me. He had loud ringing in his ears. He was able to free his legs from the wreckage and exit the airplane. He stated he was weak and had difficulty with his balance and ability to walk, shock because of the carbon monoxide poisoning as he made his way to a nearby house. But basically, and let's talk about this actual impact, because again, I know he had carbon monoxide poisoning, so there was something already going on. But I want to focus on the survivability of the landing itself. This is a forced landing, if you will. It was forced upon him, right? Now, various airplanes will behave differently, especially, depending on whether or not they have autopilot. Rule of thumb, if it's a multi-engine airplane, there's no way that both engines run out of gas at exactly the same time, the way the fuel systems are plumbed. And so one engine will fail before the other. You're going to get asymmetric thrust that the pilot who's blacked out isn't going to counter, and so it's stall spin. It's going to be deadly, almost certainly. Single-engine airplane, you might get, in effect, a little bit luckier. And this guy, in that sense, had luck on his side. It appears that the autopilot basically just continued to hold heading, more or less tried to hold the airplane up, but without stalling. And what it effectively did was trim the airplane for a speed probably near the stall speed. Now, the pilot was blacked out, so he couldn't put the gear down or the flaps down. Couldn't turn into whatever wind there was on this day, and so it was in effect sheer luck or whatever you want to call it. But to a first approximation, the autopilot just held the wings level at a slow airspeed, and if you have a little bit of luck on your side, you walk away from something like this. That's survivable. I know the airplane gets dinged up, but that's survivable. Now, let me talk about this, because this one's kind of interesting in a surprising way. Now, this pilot was the only person on board, so once he blacked out, that's it. But I want you to think about what happens in a pilot incapacitation event when there is somebody else on board. We always think about the pilot having the proverbial heart attack or seizure or whatever, and then the perfectly fine passenger has to take over the airplane. But in a carbon monoxide situation, it's also plausible, it certainly didn't happen in this case, it's plausible that the pilot blacks out from the carbon monoxide poisoning, and you have a passenger get on the radio, call ATC for help, and the passenger has not yet succumbed, but probably will soon. That has happened. I won't go into the details, and I'm not pulling up the report here. That seems to have happened in Iowa about a year or 2 years ago, where the pilot blacked out from what appears to be carbon monoxide poisoning. The person in the right seat called ATC, started to get some help. It never occurred to us that the problem occurring to the pilot was also happening to the passenger, and the passenger seems to have blacked out as well. I do want to be cautious about the final conclusion on that one. Seems to have blacked out as well, and it's always going to be tough to play what if and know what would have happened. But in that case, when the passenger took over, it, with hindsight, would have been nice if ATC had asked the passenger, "Are you feeling okay?" And it turns out there were 2 other people on board the plane. Is everybody feeling okay? Is this something that is affecting only the pilot, or does anybody else have anything else going on? The answer to that question should have been, we can't know for certain, based on the coroner's evidence, the answer should have been something like, no, we all have headaches. That should have been a huge red flag that this was carbon monoxide poisoning, and the passenger was probably going to succumb pretty soon. There's no choice but to just get them configured in the way I'm going to show you in a couple minutes, and just put it down in a farm field somewhere, preferably into the wind. There isn't time to talk somebody down, over the course of the next half hour or hour through a landing. So controllers, if you have a pilot incapacitation event and the passenger gets on the frequency, one of the first questions we should ask is if the passenger and anybody else on board is also experiencing anything at all, like headaches or anything like that, particularly up in Minnesota in the winter, or Iowa in the winter, where this other one is that I'm kind of alluding to. All right, we're going to look at one more, and then we're going to hop in the flight sim. This one was in 2005. The pilot was the only person on board, was seriously injured. This was a Cirrus SR-22. So the pilot's in cruise flight, suffered a seizure, lost consciousness. Pilot awakened, I don't know exactly how much longer, but probably not too much longer after that. The airplane was in a high-speed descent. Pilot felt disoriented, felt numbness in his right leg. Now, being a Cirrus, it does have the built-in Cirrus Airplane Parachute System, or CAPS. So the pilot recovered from the dive, made the smart decision to deploy the parachute, and so the airplane descended via the CAPS parachute and impacted in what was really the Hudson River north of New York City. Now, let me point something out about Cirrus and the few other airplanes that have parachutes. Once you pull the chute, you are along for the ride. It is a matter of luck, or whatever you want to call it, about exactly where you're going to land. There is zero way to steer the airplane. If you're headed for a house, that's what you're going to hit. If you're headed for a gas station, that's unfortunately what you're going to hit. High tension power lines, wind turbines, an elementary school, whatever, a farm field, that's what you're going to hit. The Hudson River, that's what you're going to hit. Also, the descent rate will vary with various factors, including the airplane weight. But typically, Cirrus pilots kind of think in terms of descending at something like 1,500-ish feet per minute. When you land 1,500 feet per minute, it's more or less the equivalent of being dropped from about 13 feet. So that's a significant hit. It's survivable unless you're really having bad luck and hit something bad, but that should be survivable. In this case, landing in a river, the airplane suffered substantial damage to the underside of the composite fuselage. The pilot sustained a fractured vertebra and was able to egress from the airplane before it sank. Does anybody besides the NTSB use the word egress? Subsequent medical examinations on the pilot revealed the presence of a brain tumor. Okay. Now, this pilot made a smart decision. I mean, he suddenly has a seizure, loses consciousness, recovers the dive. By all means, pull the chute. Smart decision to do the least bad thing and just ride the parachute down to wherever you're going. But keep in mind, the parachute is not just a beautiful descent to a nice smooth landing in some beautiful location. There is some luck. It's still going to be a very firm descent that can damage the airplane and damage anybody on board, but it should be survivable. With that in mind, let's hop in the sim and let's do something that is comparable to what the Cirrus does in the chute. Sorry, wrong window. That's not the flight sim. Okay. We've had two incidents in this video that were near Sioux Falls. John and Martha King were just north. The pilot of the PA-28 who had the heart attack was just west. So I've set us up from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, runway 33. We're just going to take off straight ahead. Get my feet on the rudder pedals here and keep us somewhere near the center line. We're just going to take off straight ahead. We're going to go a couple miles out, and then I'm going to show you how to configure the airplane for the kind of really break glass in case of emergency forced landing situation that I'm talking about, and we are going to actually perform it somewhere northwest of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So, oops, I banged me up there a couple times. Just going to climb out for a couple minutes. So, there are a couple of situations where we might consider this. I've already discussed a couple of them in effect. One is that carbon monoxide poisoning that affects the pilot, and the passenger comes on the frequency, and we suspect that the passenger is going to also quickly succumb. If you have something like that, there might be no choice but to just get the airplane down as survivable as possible fairly quickly. And so if you're over an area with farm fields, it might be best to do the kind of thing that those controllers or the controller and supervisor did in Sioux Falls back in 2019 and try to get the airplane down on the ground in a farm field or whatever right now, although as indicated before, I generally want to avoid roads. If you can, put the airplane into the wind. I've got the wind basically turned off right now, so there's no wind to deal with here. If you can, it's best to have, for some of these situations, get the engine shut off with the fuel and the electrics off before touchdown, including doors unlatched if practical and appropriate for that airplane. Again, that's all going to reduce the risk in the landing. It reduces the risk of fire by turning off the fuel and electrics and so on. And we'll do the setup for this here in just a moment. Just going to go a couple miles farther out and get across the what I believe is the I-29-I-90 junction here off our 11 o'clock and a half mile. Okay. I do want to put the flaps down, and I want to have the trim fly the airplane so that we are basically as slow as we can go without stalling. So this is about good enough just to do a little quick version here. So I'm just going to bring the throttle and mixture back to idle. I'm going to start dialing in some nose-up pitch trim and just get the airplane really slowed. I'm going to drop all 3 notches of flaps pretty quick, so 1, 2, 3 notches of flaps. And I'm just getting the airplane about as slow as it'll go using pitch trim. If I scroll the view down for the pitch trim, you can see I'm just bringing the pitch trim back more and more, and I'm trying to basically flirt with the stall horn. For what it's worth, I'm going to pull the fuel shut-off. I'm going to pretend that I'm unlatching the doors and pretend to click there that unlatches it, pretend to click there to unlatch it and so on. Okay, I'm going to turn the avionics master off. It doesn't really matter if I turn the light switches on or off, but I'll turn the mags off as well to kind of go through the things you would have in the checklist. You're calling whether you want to activate the ELT. Don't think we're going to hear it here. In the meantime, just want to note, all I'm doing is I'm just taking the luck of where we were going. Now, if you have a situation where somebody can steer the airplane a little bit and you're obviously heading towards an area where you got fields over here and houses over here, you might turn towards the field. But I'm just going to let this continue. All I'm doing is some very minor aileron corrections, just trying to make sure that we don't kind of drop off on one wing or the other. But I'm going to add a little more pitch trim. Okay, we're just flirting with the stall horn here. That's fine. We are at the critical angle of attack, which means we're flying really as slow as we can. This impact will be firmer than you're going to have in a Cirrus with a parachute, but it's as comparable as we can get. Okay, I'm not touching the yoke at all. We're just kind of right into the beginning of that annoying stall horn sound. This is clearly going to be a firm landing. It's not going to model us crashing. Fortunately, we're uphill here, so the way it's modeling it, we're going to kind of coast to a stop. I will tap the brakes here at the end and set the parking brake just so it doesn't roll around. But the basic idea is there's obviously some luck involved, but whether you're heading for trees or a house or whatever, but in an area with farm fields, if you really have to, you can do that. Another case where this might be used is if you have an engine failure and it's VMC, but at night, and you just can't see anything. You're out over an area where there's no airport that's reachable. What can you do? Steer the airplane into the wind, get it configured the way I've discussed here with pitch trim basically all the way nose up, flaps down, and then work on survivability. So is there anybody else on board or is it just the pilot? If it's just the pilot, get your seatbelt as tight as you can, unlatch the doors if applicable for your aircraft. If there's anybody else on board, try to get them to protect their head if they have a pillow or a teddy bear or anything else they can use to protect their head. And if there is time, try to consider stowing and securing any heavy and loose objects. But again, engine failure, VMC at night, you might have to use this kind of touchdown procedure. Engine failure, IMC, especially if it's low IMC, you might consider doing something like this as well. So there are some very rare emergency situations where we might want to do the equivalent of the landing I just did, which is more or less equivalent to pulling the parachute on the Cirrus, and try to learn some lessons from John and Martha King's crash and some other incidents so that we can improve survivability during some extreme emergencies. Thank you.